Mr. President, I've spoken on the floor twice now to tell the stories of the devastation caused by the Great Flood of 2016 and the depth of need families in Louisiana have. Since I last spoke, about 10,000 people more have applied for individual assistance through FEMA. Now, about 150,000 folks in Louisiana have applied for individual assistance. This is a serious, immediate issue, and we need help for those who are in great need. And in all the debate back and forth, we've somewhat forgotten, some people have forgotten or have never realized how massive this disaster was. An unprecedented event. The National Weather Service deemed this as a once-in-a-thousand-year event. 20 parishes have been declared disaster areas. In the city of Denham Springs, 90% of homes flooded, and in about half of the structures flooded, it'll cost owners over 50% of the value of the building to repair. 90% of the housing stock in this town has been flooded. According to estimates by the Advocate newspaper, the paper in Baton Rouge area, as many as 12,000 Baton Rouge area businesses flooded. The National Flood Insurance Program has found that when a business floods, as much as 40% of them never reopen. For a small business to reopen their door, there's great cost, and this can prove too great to rebuild. Now, the consequence of this is, of course, to the owner of the business, but it is perhaps felt more greatly by the families, by the employees and their families who lose their jobs and they aren't returned. This flooding cost $8.7 billion in damage, making it, if you take out hurricanes, this has been the most expensive natural disaster to happen in the United States in the last 100 years. So let me just repeat this. Take out Sandy and Katrina, you have the most expensive natural disaster in the last 100 years. $8.7 billion. No one was prepared, and it's not their fault. Less than a quarter of the population even had flood insurance because the flood occurred in areas more than 50 feet above sea level. One fellow called me. He lives 7 miles from the river, and he got 4 feet of water. He did not expect to have a flood, was not required to have flood insurance. Why would you when you're 7 miles away from the river? Thousands of families were completely caught off guard, again by a once-in-a-thousand-year flood, now struggling to pick up the pieces. They need our help. And they're trying to make a decision whether to rebuild or just move on. If you will, we can't afford to repair our house. We owe more than it's worth. Let's just walk away from our mortgage, buy a trailer, and hopefully be able to do something different in the future. Here's a couple examples of families affected. Now, this is a street. This is not a lake. This is a street. A family being evacuated by volunteers. The water too deep for them to get out. You can imagine if this is on the street, it is also in the house. And that which most people keep, wedding dresses, picture albums, toys, clothes, is flooded too. And when that water recedes and the water goes out of the house, also which goes out are these heirlooms, these picture albums, these clothes in piles of debris on the side of the road. So far, let me also remind you of Dorothy Brooks, 78 years old, in this picture, being rescued out of 3 feet of water. You can see the water here next to the deputy's leggings. This is in Tangipahoa Parish, and this is Sergeant Thomas Wheeler. Dorothy relies on a wheelchair. Now, as you might guess, she could not evacuate, nor could she prepare for the flooding. And Dorothy is not the only person who's handicapped or a senior citizen affected. With their age, they've been unable to evacuate, but also unable to carry out the repairs once the floodwaters recede. One example of this is Roy and Vera Rodney, both in their 80s, 4 inches of water in their house, not a whole lot, but 4 inches. The FEMA inspector told them their home was habitable, so they were denied repairs and rental assistance. But being in their 80s and no family in town, they couldn't gut and repair their home on their own. The water sat The damage to the carpet, furniture, and belongings sat. Mold came in, mold spread, and now their house is too unhealthy to live in. They've evacuated to family who live far away, and while there, they're not available to let volunteers come in to gut their house. In the weeks that they've been forced to wait, the house has remained ungutted, mold has continued to spread, and because they could not get their aid in time, the cost of recovery has grown. If you will, the Rodney story is kind of the story of the whole region. Dollars to help that come sooner will have a greater impact than the same amount of money which comes later. Again, if the Rodneys had been able to take out 4 inches of wet baseboard, furniture, carpet, wood flooring, their home would have dried, they would have rebuilt. But because they could not, mold spread, the damage increased, and now the whole house has to be remediated. So the same amount of money sooner has a greater impact than later. And that's the story of us seeking funding for Louisiana in the CR. Now, helping each other is a fundamental American value. So I ask all my colleagues to support this continuing resolution with the money for disaster relief for families, not just in Louisiana, elsewhere, but also in Louisiana, who have been faced with natural disasters, to help families like this, who've lost everything, put their lives back together. Let's do what is right, pass this legislation, pass relief for these flood victims. Mr. President, I yield back.